everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest was one of the writers of movies and shows like Thor Ragnarok, The Mandalorian, and Star Wars Rebels, of comics like X-Force, X-23, and the upcoming Unnatural Order at Vault, and more. It's Christopher Yost. Thanks for coming on, Christopher.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I have to warn you, this is the first time I think I've ever done a podcast immediately after eating. They don't have any warnings about podcasting after eating it like they do with swimming and things like that, but I just had some very good quesadilla tacos, and I might fall asleep during this podcast, so I apologize in advance.
No worries. I'll try to wake you up. We'll make it happen. We'll keep it lively. We'll keep it exciting. We'll talk about killing comic book characters. It'll be great.
I'm all about that. I'm actually kind of curious. You're in California, right?
I am. I live in lovely Los Angeles, California.
Have you been out on the picket lines, or is it an off day for you?
It is an off day for me. My son is playing a water polo game down in San Diego, and I'm heading down there to see it.
That's awesome. Well, before we get into your work on Unnatural Order, I wanted to go back to the beginning for you because it seems like comics have kind of always been a big part of your life. From what I understand, you started as a Marvel fan, right? Like that was your gateway into comics?
100%. Yeah. Like when I was a little kid, I used to read comic books, and just as an adult, I read comic books. Like I've never stopped reading comic books, but I got really introduced to it. I was honestly just thinking about this. Like, how did I get introduced to it? And I think it may have been a thing, and this is going to date me, so forgive me, everybody who thinks I'm young. There was a thing called the Electric Company, and it was kind of like a Sesame Street kind of spin-off for slightly older kids, but they had kind of a bit where they did like Spidey super stories, and it was awesome. It was, I can't even remember the years, but I think late 70s. It was before Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, but, like it was Spider-Man on TV. And, like there were always like, Spider-Man comics and whatnot, like in my life. I can't remember a time when there wasn't. But yeah, I used to buy comic books at the local grocery store. Like they're in the checkout aisle, like with National Enquirers and stuff. Like they were just a lot more accessible in mass markets. So I started reading comic books like when I could read, basically. And, my mom would bring me boxes of them, and we'd go to stores and like pick them up whenever you could. But yeah, I was always a Marvel guy. I was always a Spider-Man guy, and, eventually expanded. But yeah, it started young.
I do think it's interesting how you started with like the Electric Factory, which is not something I don't think I've ever heard that or would have expected that. I didn't even know that there was a Spider-Man element to that. But that type of thing is a lot more common than than we probably talk about. I mean, I'm sure you know this firsthand with all the different shows you've worked on that have been connected with it, like X-Men Evolution and Wolverine and the X-Men and things like that. Quite often, I mean, like for myself, like two of the biggest things for me getting into comics as a kid were the X-Men animated series in the early 90s and Batman the animated series. I had already read some comics because I was obsessed with the Transformers, and they had Transformers comics, but it is interesting to think about how there's all these kind of cross-medium gateways that appear. And I'm sure that's something you're very aware of because you've done comic stories in so many different mediums, but it does seem like your gateway to comics isn't necessarily always comics. It can quite often just be a game or a movie or a TV show or animated series or whatever.
Some kid's friend is going to hand him like his phone, and he's going to play like Marvel Snap, and then it's like, oh, that's Spider-Man. Like, like every product out there, is potentially somebody's first experience of this thing. I've been lucky enough to like work on stuff that like my Avengers show, like that could easily be some kid's like first experience of the Avengers. Obviously the movies are what they are, and everyone kind of knows Avengers now, but you never know. Like, honestly, you never know what somebody's first kind of gateway into this stuff is.
What was it that made you love comics from the start? Like, was there something about the medium that just spoke to you even as a kid, or was it just like there was this unspeakably cool element that you couldn't really pin down?
I remember liking Spider-Man because he was funny, and then realizing that he was funny because he was scared, and I think for me, who was, not to shock anybody here, who was a fairly introverted, quiet kid, I related to that, like I, used humor as a shield to a certain extent when I was little, and now. And always, and I really related to him. So like he was a relatable figure, whereas, and again, this is not to cause a big Marvel DC things, like I couldn't relate to Batman that much.
Right.
But, but Spider-Man I could. Like he felt very human to me, and like I was always worried about him. And I
Hmm.
always had to read more because I wanted to make sure he was okay.
I do think that that is a very underrated element too. I don't know. It is interesting how sometimes you read comics and it's just like sometimes you just want to make sure that the characters you really enjoy are just okay. Like that is a perfectly like rational reason to want to read. I mean, it's the same reason why people watch shows sometimes. I mean, sometimes that doesn't always work out. Like if you're a Game of Thrones fan, probably not the best
Yeah, don't
path
get
to
attached.
don't get attached, don't get attached, but it is interesting. Like that is one of those things that's like that immediate connection. It's like when you can see yourself on the page and you can see your experiences on the page. Then next thing you know, you start falling in love with the medium and you start getting deeper into it. And I'm sure that the reasons why you love it today are completely different than why you loved it then. But there's probably still a little bit of that there too, right?
100%. Like there's yes, absolutely. Like there's a million more things I appreciate about it. Like from like the art and craft itself, and working with all these amazing people, and just like like the designs and the cool factors, and just like a stunning visual page and a shocking twist and all that. But at the core, like everybody does these things, and everyone watches these things, and everyone reads these things because they care. Like, and I think that it's easy to forget. It's easy for some people to put some humanity in there, something for people to latch on to, but like it really matters. It's the most important thing to care about these characters and these relationships, and what they're fighting for and why they're fighting for it.
So you went to school for film, both for your bachelor's degree and your master's in fine arts. I am kind of curious though as to whether or not at that point you had was making comics something that was in your brain, or was that just something that you kind of thought would have been cool if it happened to pan out?
No, it never in a million years occurred to me that I would ever even be able to write a comic book. I think the first time I ever considered writing a comic book when somebody asked me if I wanted to write a comic book. Like it just seemed like such a, even though I'd done like animated stuff, and I'd done some like TV, like the idea that I could write a comic book, and I don't know why, because I'm kind of an idiot, but it just seemed so magical of a thing that of course I wouldn't be able to do that. Of course I've never had the chance to do that, because like that's the gold ring. Like that's the highest you could ever achieve, because I just love comic books so much, and I still do. It's still my favorite thing to write.
What makes film and TV a little bit more attainable in that sense? Is it because because you went to film school, you were more aware of how it worked versus comics where it was just this like black box that you couldn't really see into?
Yeah, like I started in advertising, oddly enough. Like I did the undergraduate film thing, and again, like I think I'm fairly narrow-minded. But it didn't occur to me that I could move to LA or New
Hmm.
York or wherever they made things. So I got into advertising in Detroit, where I'm from. And at a certain point, I'm like, well, I've done this. Maybe I could try to do something else. And at the very least, if I could get this like master's degree in fine arts, I could at least maybe I could be a teacher, or I could teach a college course, something like that. But like like it never, even that didn't seem super attainable. And then all of a sudden I was doing it, and then it seemed a little more attainable. But yeah, it's one of those things where everybody that does this is lucky to be doing it to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And I never thought I would be that lucky, but I am. Apparently, I am that lucky.
You have a very fascinating fork in the road moment where you could have just stayed with advertising, but instead you went this route and kind of, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but it seems like you kind of lived your childhood dreams in a lot of ways.
Well, it's funny, right? Because like oddly enough, one of the things that precipitated was my dad passed away when I was probably like 25 or so. And with the insurance money, I actually went to graduate school.
Hmm.
So it was one of those moments where like I had a major life change, and I had a chance to do something different, and I took it. I moved out to California with my wife, and we always said we'd give it 5 years. And if we assumed that for 5 years we would just move back home, but I got extremely fortunate in that I was able to hook up with Marvel, and got offered work and went from there. And 24 years, we're still out here.
That is a very good result. You brought up working with Marvel. You had interned at Marvel's West Coast office in the early 2000s, back when it was like 6 people. And it does seem, at least from the outside, like that was the moment in some ways that your career path kind of crystallized. Looking back on it now, was that the case, or is it just kind of another step in your journey?
I think around that time I knew I wanted to write. Like I'd met a few writers, like a few actual screenwriters through the USC film program that I was part of. And it seemed just incredible, and like I'd always done like, some like creative writing classes in high school and stuff like that. I had like I think one screenwriting class in undergraduate and wrote this ridiculous thing, but like I loved it, and like I never stopped thinking about it. But again, like it never super occurred to me that I could actually do that for a living. But the business part of it, like I was doing that for TV commercials and radio commercials. I'm like, well, why not? So in one of those, well, why not me moments, I, made that move. The Marvel thing though is like a dream you never even knew you had. Like, oh my God, like I'm working for Marvel. I still don't know that I've fully reconciled it.
Well, and it's also kind of interesting because this was Marvel post bankruptcy, post opening a West Coast branch to try to kind of drum up business in Hollywood. And it was not the Marvel Studios that I think people envision.
Definitely not.
What was that like?
It was still pretty awesome. Like it was Avi Arad, Kevin Feige had come on like a couple of weeks before me. There was a guy named Rick Unger who was kind of in charge of TV, and his executive Craig Kyle, who would later go on to I worked with many things on him together, and that was about it. And they were kind of working on Spider-Man 1 with Tobey Maguire. They were working on Ang Lee's Hulk. Like those were the two big ones that were kind of happening while I was there. But yeah, like largely they would partner up with other studios who had the rights to these things, and like consult and be producing partners and creative partners. And I got to photocopy a lot of comic books and a lot of official handbook of the Marvel Universe entries, and it was fantastic. All of my Marvel trivia really paid off.
I was going to say that there was in a New Yorker article that you're a big part of about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They shared an anecdote, or specifically you shared an anecdote about how Kevin Feige actually quizzed you about Marvel trivia, calling it a comic book trivia off. Was that before you were hired, or was that while you were one?
No, that was like my interview.
That was your interview?
Yeah, I came in and met with him, and he asked me questions about like I swear to God, I think it was like what issue did the black suit premiere in of Amazing? And I'm like, of course it's like, well, it famously appeared in Amazing before it appeared in Secret Wars, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it was one of those things where I couldn't believe I was talking about this stuff in a job interview, but it was freaking awesome. Like, and I mean, like, I love that he knew too. Like, it was like, like we're all fans. Like, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't like love it. But, to like have the idea that like knowing these things is part of my job, that's amazing.
Well, I do think it's interesting too, because it seems like a lot of what you were doing at the time and what the office was doing was kind of like packaging these things together. So normally like having like trivia questions about like, when did Wolverine first appear? Was it actually 180 or was it actually 181? That might seem like unnecessary minutia, but to some degree, it kind of matters. It matters in how you're positioning these things and like the history of these characters. And when you're trying to pitch studios or whatever about that, it's both kind of like an imposing thing, an exciting thing for a job interview, but also kind of a necessary thing.
Well, it's funny because like nobody'd ever be like, oh, you just kind of wing it. It's a biopic of like some famous human individual, like a real person. Like, I mean, in a lot of ways, like I have a love for these characters that is shared by many, many people, like it's personal to me. Like I love Spider-Man. Like I know as much about them as I can. So yeah, like I mean, like, and again, like for the job, yeah, like if there's some obscure story about Logan that like isn't well known, but like super important to this particular story or this particular moment, super helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of funny, like just thinking from the perspective like Thor Ragnarok. Now that's a movie that you co-wrote, but it's when you look at it, there's parts of different stories kind of meshed in there, and like you have like big beats. Like one of my favorite stories ever is Walt Simonson's story where Scourge, what is it? He stood alone at Jalabrew. Like that storyline, like you get that in there, but you don't really, it'd be pretty hard to write one of those where you're kind of meshing all these beats together if you don't have familiarity with this type of stuff. Obviously that was down the line, but at the same time, it's like, that is one time where it definitely pays off to be a big nerd.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like some of these are iconic moments that like are burned into your memory. But I mean, like like you were working on a Thor movie, you owe it to yourself to like do the deep dive, man. Like, and again, like Simonson's Run, like, like I had already read and absorbed and knew by heart well before, those days. But I mean, like, yeah, like you want to honor the character and honor the history and honor the stories. And like, I always said this on Avengers, on the cartoon. I want to show people what I love about it.
Right.
And that's my goal. Like, I want to take some 10-year-old kid and be like, this is why it's awesome. This is like what I love. And this is why these stories are great and these characters are great. And I'm going to show you. That's my goal.
And that's the case for the comics too, right?
Of course. You want to tell great stories with these characters because, like, like you owe it to the characters. Like, these characters were created before I was born and they're going to be around after I die. And, like, if I can add to the tapestry, great. But, like, also, it's the major leagues. Like, if you're going to play in that sandbox, bring your best.
I do think it's kind of interesting that you've emphasized a couple times you're a Spider-Man guy growing up. And a big part of your journey actually ended up being the X-Men. Not that like you can't be a X-Men fan while also being a Spider-Man fan, but you ended up doing your first gig in animation was X-Men Evolution, and you also did Wolverine and the X-Men later, and then you did a lot of X-Men comics. Were you an X-Men fan growing up?
Not as much. I think my first real exposure to them was Secret Wars. Like I had no idea who they were. Like, and then I remember it's like, well, no, I think I knew Nightcrawler because he was in like an issue of Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But like in reading them in Secret Wars, I'm like, I love these guys and I want to know more about them. So I started reading Uncanny X-Men. The first Uncanny X-Men issue I ever read was like they were fighting like dire wraiths and like Rom the Space Knight showed up, and I'm just like, what the hell? Why? Like I didn't know what Rom was or a dire wraith was, but man, it was great. There's like John Romita Jr. art, just Claremont like on fire, like Storm had just lost her powers. I'm like, oh, I have no idea what's going on in any storyline here, but I'm in.
I think that's one of the funniest things about like when I was growing up, when it comes to like superhero stuff, I think it's really funny that a lot of times not knowing things seems like it's this insurmountable roadblock for people to get into superhero comics. But the first comic I read that was X-Men was like this part of a storyline, Executioner's Song, in which like Cable apparently tried to assassinate Professor X. And it ends up being that Cable's nemesis, Strife, is actually a clone of him. And I didn't know who any of these characters were outside of like the animated series. And I was so perplexed. I was just like, everyone seems to be related and everyone seems to be somehow connected to the Summers family. I don't know what's going on, but I really want to find out. And it is kind of funny how like when you're a kid and you're reading this stuff, there's something primal to like, I don't know what's going on, but I gotta know what's going on. So I'm just going to do whatever I can to figure out the answers are.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like not everybody can roll with it, but like I mean, like I started watching X-Files in season 3. Like I've joined many shows that are complicated. Like in mid-season, I'm just like, like nowadays you can just like go back and stream it, but back in the day, like on network, because again, I'm old. Like like you got to wait for repeats or something. Like or gonna come out on VHS one day. I don't know. Like I think there's just like an openness to it, but I mean, again, like if the characters are compelling and like whatever story is put in front of you is fun and exciting and like like gets its hooks in you, then you know what, you'll figure it out as you go.
And now a quick word from one of our sponsors. Do you wish that buying and reading digital comics was even easier? Well, I have good news. Omnibus is here for you. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses all day and date. They're pay per book, just like your LCS, but digital, so you're already used to the experience. Their focus is on building an excellent customer shopping and reading experience and using novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book. They feature top-tier content and already have many of the top publishers in comics today on board. Want to find the right digital comic shop for you? Download Omnibus today on the Apple App Store to do just that. And now, back to the show. So, your very first writing gig from Marvel, as far as I understand, was X-23. It was the miniseries, the very first miniseries for that character. And that is a character that originally debuted in X-Men Evolution, but you ended up helping define with your frequent co-writer, the aforementioned Craig Kyle. I did want to ask about Laura, because that character has proven to be a lasting one and a very popular one at that. There are people who rep for Wolverine or Talon or whatever you want to call her these days. Actually, I guess there's two different versions. The ones who do really, really love her. Obviously, you've written a lot of other titles and characters in comics, but do you think that in a lot of ways, defining that character and making her a real part of the Marvel Universe with Craig after she already existed elsewhere is maybe the most lasting impact you've had in comics?
Well, I mean, okay, a couple things. Like X-23 is 100%, from the brain of Craig Kyle. Like he had the initial idea, and then he and I wrote her together. So, like, I mean, again, like I have added to her certainly, but all due credit to Craig. Like he is an idea machine, and like Laura just literally like Athena jumping out of Zeus's brain or whatever it was. Like, like Laura is definitely his baby, but I owe my career to a certain extent to X-23. Like, I mean, like she was the first paid writing gig I've ever had. Like she was the first comic book I ever wrote. And again, like it's staggering to think that like we're coming up on 20 years of X-23. Like it's a testament to like like that creation that like and people have really embraced her. Like she's really connected with people, and like that's super powerful. And I'm kind of in awe of it. And like she's fun to write. Like like it's a super dark character. Like she's had a horrific life and all this abuse and whatnot. But like like we're able to like do some pretty fun stuff with her too. And hopefully like that's not over, and we can continue to tell some more stories with her one day. I'm pretty sure Craig's got one in mind. So like at the end of the day, like I love Laura. I'll always love Laura because largely we're here talking because of her.
It is kind of amazing to see how long that she's lasted. You hadn't written comics before then, but all of a sudden you were jumping into that new medium with this character that had appeared in, I think it was NYX where she first appeared. She didn't have, I mean, I guess like we didn't know that much about her at that point. When you first started writing comics, when you first started writing that one, was there some level of intimidation to taking the medium on, or did you have a pretty good feel for it just because you'd had decades of reading at that point?
I don't know that I'd ever seen a comic book script before then. So like I hopped on the old internet and found some samples, and just kind of like faked my way out. Like at the end of the day, like comic book writing is a very specific kind of writing. Like it's not the same as screenwriting. It's not the same as animation writing. Like the format just demands like a different thought process to kind of like lay out a page and figure out, like these moments, these snapshots that create, like this kind of like experience. So like it was exciting, but again, like I've been reading comic books my whole life. So like, I kind of like, even though I didn't have the language to describe what I was doing, I kind of knew what, needed to be done to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And, like I never want to go back and, read my very first stuff because I'm sure I'd be horrified, but, it seems to have done all right. But yeah, like I don't know, like I think I was so excited to do it. Like I think I really just like shut down my brain and decided not to think too much about it and just like put it out there.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting that you say that there isn't, like, obviously screenwriting is completely different than writing comics. But I am interested in whether or not you feel like writing those different mediums. You've written in animation, you've written animated features and shows, you've written feature-length movies, you've written comics. I'm sure you've written other things that I am unaware of, but you've been doing a lot of writing in a lot of forms and mediums. Do you feel like what you've learned from animation impacts your comic writing, and what you learned from comics impacted your screenwriting in like ways you can actually feel? Or do you find that your work in, I don't know, like maybe it doesn't have that cross medium impact beyond the fact that like it's just putting reps in and figuring things out?
I think about this a lot too, right? Because like they are different to a certain extent. And, at the end of the day, like one of the things we talk about in live action a lot is like, well, don't direct on the page. Like that's the director's purview. Whereas in like animation, like, like you direct more on the page for whatever reason. Like it's totally, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But, like I think that a lot of it is like how much of your visual stylings go into any particular description. Like at the end of the day in a comic book, you're telling the story, but like the artist is 3,000% your collaborator because they're designing everything, they're lighting everything, they're like it's the artist brings so much and animators bring so much, and like obviously like entire film crew and all this stuff. It just depends as a writer how much you want to give. Like I always think, what's the minimum amount that this needs to be awesome? Like as far as the script goes, and then like your partner in this endeavor is going to come in and just make it even better. Like you don't want to write so much that it puts them in a corner that they can't then like contribute. Like I want their ideas. I want the collaboration. I want an artist to like, like be able to like, yeah, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do this because like
Hmm.
chances are that is going to be awesome and even better, like so, like I don't want to limit anyone, but I also don't want to limit myself. So like it's like finding that balance. And like the hope is that you're talking to all these people and saying, "Hey, this is an idea, but I'm always ready to take the better idea."
When you say direct on the page, do you mean that you don't want to like try to prescribe or define actions like that would be taking place on like the screen, for example?
Yeah, it's like I don't want to like place the camera necessarily. I don't want to be like, it's like at a 63-degree angle, a high shot looking down at this. Like I want to, describe what's going on. I want to describe the emotion of what's going on. I want to describe what that character is like feeling and like, like what's going through their head. And like, then hopefully together we can find out the best way to kind of visualize that. Whereas, there are directors, that'll pat you on the head and be like, oh, that's lovely. I'm going to do this. Like you don't know necessarily in any given situation who you're going to be collaborating with. But, with comic books, like, I can just email them. When I write a script for a feature or whatever it is, like, it could be 10 years before like a director comes on board. So I was lucky enough to work with this writer named Javi on a project, and he kind of turned my head around on it. And it's like, you're not just like, creating a blueprint for other people to take and make things out of. Like, you're writing. Like, like if you're going to write, then write. Like, make it an engaging read.
Mm-hmm.
Like put ideas out there in a way that's like, going to hook people and engage them and make it a page turner and like, really like paint a picture, like why not? So like, again, like I don't know necessarily who's going to direct something that I'm going to write, but like I'm going to put the vision out there.
It does seem like to some degree that general thought is true no matter what medium you're working in. Where to take Unnatural Order as an example. It's like Vault brought that team together. Like you didn't bring Val Rodriguez in, the artist on the book, and so you didn't necessarily know who was going to be on that book as you had the idea of Unnatural Order. But like with film or like with animation, you have to leave space for your collaborative storytellers to be able to bring this to life in the best possible way. So it seems like a really big part, a commonality between no matter what medium you're working in is you have to trust your collaborators.
100%, because I mean, for every one thing that's something you imagine differently, like, there's 100 things that they're going to bring to it that I'd never thought about at all. Like I don't know what that particular, like room looks like, like I know what's important about that room for the story, but
Mm-hmm.
like, he's the one that has to like dress that set, like, and I think that like Val has brought stuff and character designs that I never even considered, like, to a certain extent, because like, he's the one that has to put it on the page. And, again, like he's taking what I've written and expanding on it, times a million.
I also think it's interesting that you've worked in superheroes on like three different mediums because animation, film, and comics are like completely different. But at the same time, it's fundamentally built from the same place, which is where you're basically extracting decades of stories and trying to find the best way to turn that into something new. Like, I know you joined a writing lab at Marvel Studios in 2010 where you helped develop characters for film, including working on the first three Thor films to varying degrees, but particularly co-writing Thor the Dark World and Thor Ragnarok. And it is kind of interesting because it seems like, especially in those early days, I imagine a lot of what you were doing was like the same fundamentals you take on as a comic writer, where you're trying to, I don't know, throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks and then formalize it into something concrete that you can work with that's based off of this tapestry that already exists before you.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly with the films, like, like it's like, how do we bring this character to life in a way that like makes sense, to a mass audience who may not, have 40 years of history under their belt, like how do you do a Thor movie for somebody who's never really heard of Thor, like what's a way to humanize these characters, much like they've done in the comic books, and like, bring it to a big audience. Like it's, like Marvel Marvel in the comics, they've done it to a certain extent, and so like, how do you modernize it? How do you, I don't know, just like bring it to life? Like, there's no better way to kind of really say it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, how do you also stay true to the spirit of the comic book, even if it's not to the detail of it? Like it's Tony Stark, being in a cave in Afghanistan, versus Vietnam. Like it doesn't have to be like particularly one for one because you're honoring the spirit of that story. And I mean, there have been more that have gone fully, off the rails, and whether they work or not, like that's for history to judge. But I mean, like, I think that for a comic book fan to go in there and be like, well, that's not exactly, how it went down in the comic books, but like, I see Iron Man on the screen. Like the feel of him is right. The attitude is right. The costume is right in the feels, as they say.
I totally agree. I actually have long said that like my thing for adaptations is it's about the spirit. It's like if you can get that energy right and like the kind of the fundamentals right, that's when it really works. But the last thing I want to say about the movies before we move on to Unnatural Order in full is I just want to share a take from my wife with you.
Sure.
She had no experience whatsoever with comics before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And she absolutely loves the Thor movies, particularly the first three. She reps for them very hard. And her strongest MCU take is that the Thor movies were always funny, even before Ragnarok. And I just want to share that because she feels like everyone slept on their comedic offerings. I agree with her. I actually think that I was very fond of the fish out of water stuff in the first movie in particular. I know that that was one you only worked on a bit, but it is kind of funny when Thor Ragnarok came out, obviously a very funny movie. It was fascinating to see how there was like this sudden realization that the Thor movies were funny, and I'm like, I kind of think they always were to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think they always had like kind of like a little bit of charm and a little bit of whimsy to them. Like I think Kenneth Branagh like is that way. Like I mean, he's obviously very Shakespearean, but like he's also like a pretty fun guy too. Like I think Dark World, like was much more serious, but it had great moments of humor in it, and a lot of that is like Chris Hemsworth. Chris Hemsworth is a tremendously funny guy. Like we would hang out on set and he'd be just cracking people up. Like he's great, and like third one obviously took it that much further, and Taika's like mad genius, and like they just kind of embraced the sensibility that just like really paid off,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that yes, like you want to have fun with the character, but you don't want to make fun of the character, like, and I think that like all these characters that can laugh at themselves a little bit, without like crapping all over them, like I think that there's a sweet spot there that I think people really responded to.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about Unnatural Order. It's your comic series at Vault that will be launching right after this podcast is released. But a little over a month after we're chatting, it is with the aforementioned artist Val Rodriguez, colors Dervla Kelly, and world design. Here's the solicit. I'm going to read it out real quick. After the fall of the Britons and the Roman invasion of Hibernia, the captive known only as the Druid is released, sending a darkness across the world, an age of horrors of fire and entrails. As the innocent burn in the wicker fields, those who would resist learn of the existence of a man who even the Druid fears. For it is this prisoner, a soldier from a different time, who alone knows the Druid's secret. This is not how the world is supposed to be. I really enjoyed the first issue on a number of different levels. Val's art is fantastic. Dervla's colors are incredible. It looks great. But more than that, I think the thing that I was really impressed by is that it is a genuinely surprising read. Like it takes some very unexpected turns. And I read that this was you trying to find a way to have fantasy collide with the real world in a very specific way. What made that fusion of interest to you?
And it's been going on for like 15 years. Like something I read this book. It was called Magic Kingdom for Sale, and it's by the great Terry Brooks. And it is about a lawyer who ends up in a magical fantasy kingdom. And I loved it. I loved it with all my heart. So it was something that always stuck with me. Something I wanted to do, and I thought that there was a lot to it. In trying to honor that idea, like this is kind of what I started coming up with. And like again, like I really sweat over that solicitation because like I didn't want to give anything away, but at the same time, like you kind of had to make a choice.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, it's a funny book because I feel like if you described number one too much, you kind of get rid of some of the story impact, and I imagine that is only going to escalate the further down the series you get.
Yeah, like look, by the time you're into the second issue, like you're gonna know the score, to a certain extent. And then the third issue, like, something else happens that kind of like messes it all up. Like at the end of the day, like I want to keep readers guessing. I want to keep them surprised. I want to like, really bring them on this journey. But, like I think that I almost like really push to call this a zero issue. Um, only because like I'm a 90s comic book guy,
Yeah.
like it felt like a good idea. Like, like there's a lot of setup to be had here. But yeah, like I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, by the time you get to the end of the fourth issue, and that being said, like that's 150 pages of story by the end of the fourth issue.
Right.
Like these are all oversized like issues. Like it's a full story, but it just sets up this world for like even bigger things.
Have you been developing Unnatural Order to some degree since you read that Terry Brooks book?
Not seriously. Like, like the idea is really hung on, but as far as the specifics of it, the only specific I had was something that happens very directly in issue three. I'm super excited for it. Like it's one of my favorite things.
How long have you been developing it then?
Probably 4 years.
Oof. Yeah.
And again, like, when time permits.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's always kind of amazing in comics, though, is like even when you're not like writing movies and shows and stuff like that, a lot of these ideas take a while to percolate because it's like maybe it starts with you reading a Terry Brooks book and it carries on and you start picking things up and you start shifting things and et cetera, et cetera. And then next thing you know, like the idea really starts to kind of come together 4 years ago, but it really needs even more time to kind of become what it is. I did actually want to bring up one thought I had as I was reading Unnatural Order #1. It very much feels like an RPG. Like, I don't know if you've ever played any RPGs or anything like that, but particularly with the disparate types of characters, there's almost classes of characters. Like I'm playing like an early Final Fantasy game or something. Was that a feeling you were trying to evoke, or is that just something that kind of comes naturally from the genre?
It's funny because like I don't want to again not to spoil anything, but there's a certain feel to these characters that you'll realize is purposeful. And like it very much, when we say the world is not how it's supposed to be, like somebody is making it like this purposefully, so like it everything you're saying is on the right path. It's not exactly RPG, but like it's something very similar.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. You did tell The Beat in an interview that there are, and I quote, 3 characters in the series that are going to approach the story from radically different perspectives, which with each of them knowing the world isn't how it should be, but disagreeing on how precisely that is. It is interesting. Reading that line, I already read the book before I read that line, but reading that line actually really sold me on the book even more because if it was like just a straight fantasy tale where, is it Iadok? Iadok the druid?
Yodak.
Yodak, yeah. So if it's just him, where he's this big bad druid at the heart of it, I feel like I've read that before. I feel like I've kind of read that type of story. But if it's the case where not everyone is a straight hero or a straight villain, or we don't totally understand what's going on, it becomes a lot more interesting. I'm curious as to like what made that the kind of differing perspectives on how the world should work very like fertile, dramatic territory for you.
I think nothing is black and white. Like it's just not. Like at the end of the day, like this evil druid that's the greatest power in all the land. Like all right, but then what? Like you've taken over the world. Now what? Like why did you even want to do that? It seems like a hassle. Like I think that you'll discover that there's a lot more to Yodak than it seems. That he is a lot older than you would tend to think. And he's seeing the world in a very, very, very specific way, even beyond what you're seeing in the first issue, because you're going to catch up with him later, and he's not going to be what you think. And I think that there's 2 other characters in the first issue that are going to make choices that are very different than what you would think. And there's a whole 4th character that you're going to meet in the second issue that is going to have a huge impact on the series that will be the polar opposite of what you'll think. Anytime like you think you know what a character is, like I really want to make sure that rug is pulled out from under you.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. October is here and things are cooling off for fall, but not over on Zoop, where this month is going to be hot. There are too many campaigns to name, but there will be launches from the legendary Howard Chaykin, Second Coming's Richard Pace, the team behind the comic Kanto, Green Lantern's V. Ken Marion, and the creator of the TV show The Goldbergs, Adam F. Goldberg. And that's just scratching the surface for October with so much more on the way. Head over to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign for the ones coming soon. It takes less than 30 seconds to create an account, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. I like that because, I mean, it just reminds me of the old line of everyone's the hero of their own story. It's not like...
100%.
Yeah, it's not like Yodak is sitting on that island in the beginning of the book just thinking like, man, I can't wait to get off this so I can be the worst person ever and just be terribly evil. He probably is just like, I've been oppressed. I want to get off this island so I can make things right the way that I think they should be. And that makes it a lot more interesting because... I don't know. I mean, it's funny, not to bring it back to the MCU, but I think that's part of the reason why people have responded so much to like villains like Thanos and like Killmonger, for example, where you kind of see their point. You also recognize that maybe they're going a little intense, but at the same time, you're just like, I kind of get it. And so that kind of understanding, I think, is very crucial to making characters like this work. And even saying that, I don't even think Yodak is going to be as straightforward as like Thanos or Killmonger in that way.
No, I mean Yodak's pretty bad, but you're gonna find out a lot more about him. You know, like I think the gold standard for villains, and Craig Kyle and I talk about this all the time, is Ed Harris in The Rock.
Oh yeah,
you're absolutely 100% correct. You are 10,000% right. Everything you're saying is absolutely right. How you are going about getting what that is bad. You know, like I think Magneto is right, but how he's going about fixing the problem, bad. In the movies, Thanos, absolutely probably right. You know, but how he's going about solving that problem, you know, if you got through magic glove, and you could probably snap your fingers for many different solutions. You know, but like you're choosing kind of one of the most horrific ones. So like, you know, like you're right. You know, like every good villain is the hero of their own story. But I mean, like the best ones, like you agree with. Like I agree with them, but you know, like what you're doing and how you're trying to achieve your goals, bad.
I just want to say that was probably the Ed Harris take is probably one of the strongest I've had on this podcast in the entire history of it. And I actually, I don't know if I would say he's like the best, but he is a very good villain. I mean, like there's the shower scene when the soldiers all raid the Alcatraz, and they all, like, you can tell that they just agree with them, but they're following orders because it's what they're supposed to do. And it makes it it makes it really impactful. And plus, Ed Harris, where can you go wrong?
Ed Harris, oh my God, you can't.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah, he's fantastic. That movie's fantastic. And in graduate school, the two writers that I met that kind of convinced me that I should give this a try wrote The Rock.
Oh, The Rock, very important in your life in a lot of ways. I love it. I'm a big supporter of 90s action movies. It was a very strong time for very excellent action movies. But I'm curious as to, like, fantasy is a genre where, especially in recent years, it feels like we've gotten a lot of it in a lot of different mediums. And comics in particular has had a lot of fantasy stories. Do you think that to some degree with fantasy stories like this that you need to find something to differentiate your story from the rest? Like you just can't play back the same beats. Like, you know, the druid is bad and it's as straightforward as that, because otherwise you could, you know, easily be labeled as derivative or just be forgotten as quickly as you're released.
Well, I don't think it's just fantasy. I think that's true of every genre and every story. Like I think that there is so much out there of everything that you have to find a way. It's not just enough to do it well. You know, like obviously that it should start with that, you know, whatever you're going to do. But I mean, like, I think that all of these movies have to find new ways to kind of like surprise people. Like, I mean, it's like, I'm going to do the best version of what you've seen before is not a winning formula. Like, it's just like, I'm going to show you something you've never seen before within like a framework that you love. Then, you know, like, I think you've got something. And whether this is it or not, who can say? But I mean, like, I don't know that I've ever seen this.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting to think about, you know, in some ways, the streaming era and comics have kind of a similar problem in that, I guess this is the case for everything, but if you don't hook people with that first episode or that first comic with like something that they haven't seen before or something that really feels different, like the last page of the first issue of Unnatural Order, you get to that and you're like, oh, I really don't know where this is going to go. And it seems like, you know, if you don't hook in that one time, there's just so many other things you could be reading or watching that you'll lose people really quick. So you kind of have to like front load stuff in a very specific way.
Agreed. And it's not just the first episode, too. It's pretty much every episode now. Like, I think the second episode hook on TV series is almost even more critical. And I mean, again, like the amount of data that the streamers have on this is staggering. Like, like there's so many meetings I've had about the algorithm and what we need to do because of the algorithm. And oh my God, don't even get me started. But, like they're not necessarily wrong. Like, I mean, like you are competing for attention on a scale never seen before. So like you have so many options out there of things to watch, and like generally, like if I can't hold your attention, then you're out. So like at the end of the day, like every episode has to have a pretty meaty hook. Like every episode has to like be compelling, and like to a certain extent, well, why not? Why shouldn't it be? Like
Yeah.
If it's worth an hour of your life, make it good. But I mean, like yeah, like I think that like you want every in comics more than anything, like is a perfect example of that, because like there's like a cliffhanger ending at the end of a comic book. Come on, that's a month you're gonna have to sweat through until you can find out what happened. Like that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. This is actually your first original ongoing, right? Unnatural Order?
Yeah, I did Killer of Demons at Image, and there was 3 issues and kind of done.
Yeah.
So it definitely wasn't like designed as an ongoing, but this is ongoing.
It is interesting because like I'm not saying that you're going to be sitting sweating thinking about like I got to make sure I got a hook in every single issue. Maybe you do, but it's interesting to think about that and the fact that like if you look at your career, a lot of the stuff you've worked on has infrastructure you can build off of. There's no continuity, there's no history to lean on. This is you and Val and the rest of the team bringing something completely new to life. How does that feel? Like, is that exciting, challenging, imposing, a little bit of all of that? Or is it just an opportunity?
I mean, it's a little bit of all that. I mean, like, whether Chris Yost was working on it or not, people were probably going to go see Thor Ragnarok. Like whether I was involved in Mandalorian season 1, there are a good chance people were going to watch it anyway. Whereas this endeavor is like a wholly Chris Yost kind of like concept and universe and idea and all that. Like, yeah, like it's a little daunting, but also, you kind of want to at some point live or die by your own sword. Like if people like the story, it's because of me. If people don't like the story, it's because of me. And that's fine. Like I'm happy to kind of like put it out there because you kind of have to. Like at a certain point, like the story was inside me, and I'm super excited to get it out there.
I did want to ask about the vault of it all because they're obviously the publisher, but they're also a fascinating renegade partner in the sense that they, the first issue, for listeners that don't know, is completely free for comic shops, with shops being able to determine what price they charge when released. And it is a really fascinating thing to see because most of the time you don't really see companies that sell stories give them away in such a way. And it is a wild move, but I also believe it is a smart and worthwhile risk in a super weird market. What was your initial reaction when the idea was presented to you?
I thought I'd misheard him. Honest to God, like I thought I'd misheard him. Like and then I really thought about it, and I'm just like, I don't know how money works, but I'm pretty sure this isn't the way you make it.
Right.
But they kind of walked me through it, and I'm just like, damn, that's like bold. I'm grateful to them, like on a level I can't even like express, like how much they believe in this book. That they're gonna like, they're gonna put it on the line, for this. And again, like it's their company and they're great at what they do, and this their choices to make. But I mean, like, I can't even. I'm still kind of like stunned at like how grateful I am for what they're doing. Like the amount of attention this has gotten. Like the amount you want people to like take a chance on it. And like I think that the hope is that this pays off and people love it and be excited for it and like get issue 2, and then like the numbers just start that much higher for an issue 2. Like because I mean like it's easy to like go into a comic shop and like look at this and look at that and not pick it up and not take a chance, but there's no cost to entry really, like, or a very low cost to entry probably. Like why not try it? And I mean I think that like a lot of people just don't try new things because like look, it's a modern world and things are expensive and et cetera, et cetera. But for them to put this out there, and for retailers too, like to just like, here, give it a try. Like I just think it's awesome.
I think it's super smart. And I actually think it's kind of underrated. There's parts of it that I think are super underrated. Like I described the secret sauce of the whole plan as being that had to come in 25 issue bundles. Because like if you don't have the 25 copies, shops might just be like, oh, I guess I'll take 5. But like the risk reward for Vault is they need people to like take a lot of copies. And the good news for you is like, earlier today it was announced that it was over 137,000 copies ordered, which I did not check with Vault, but I have to imagine it is by far the most copies of any of their comics that has ever been ordered. And, they may be mad scientists, but it seems like there was some method to their madness in the process.
I think they're super smart. Like I would never. I don't even know how you think of stuff like that. Like at the end of the day, like like honestly, like we just want the book in people's hands,
Yeah.
and this felt like a great way to help, get it out there, to help retailers, to like really put a jolt in the arm, like, and I think that like even if this book ends up in the dollar bin, but still you're making $1 out of nothing. Like it's still a win for the retailer, hopefully. So like I think, look, just from an exposure, just from like putting comic books in people's hands, like I think it's amazing.
You had a relationship with them on the film set already, right? With Vault.
Yeah, we had talked about a couple of different books that they had. They had one with Mark Wahlberg called Alien Bounty Hunter that we tried to work up as a movie for a long time. And then there's another one called Heist that we've talked about. And just through like those projects, like I got to know them a little bit, and I brought up this idea, and they were like, super excited about it. So like it didn't occur to me to go elsewhere, really.
Yeah. I mean, so it really just came down to like you brought it up to them, they were into it, and there was trust there basically.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the books they were putting out. They were putting out great stuff, and it wasn't superhero stuff, and this wasn't like a superhero idea, particularly. So like it felt like like and again, like I didn't know if anybody would be particularly interested in this, So I kind of told them the idea, and they really like vibed with it.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting though, because it's like, let's say you took it to some publisher you didn't have a relationship with. I imagine that free pitch, like, what if we just gave it away to retailers? I mean, I don't know. Like knowing them already probably made something like that a little bit more palatable because you could see where they're coming from in their explanation, but also you knew who they were.
Yeah, look, I mean, like they're businessmen, and they're in this business to do business. Like that sounded dumb, but you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah.
Like I think this is a savvy business ploy. To a certain extent, in the best way. Like it's good for everybody, and like the hope is it will be good for them long term.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they would do it if it didn't make sense on a particular level.
I completely agree. I mean, like the biggest issue for comics these days is, well, one of the biggest issues. There's a number of them, but attrition tends to be the issue. And it's like, if you have a higher ceiling with the first issue, it's like number 2 is just going to be way better by comparison. I mean, you're going to have a much healthier place to start at there. And then it can kind of keep cascading down the line. But I want to close with some bigger thoughts. Like it is actually kind of interesting to think about how comprehensive this time of change is for people who tell and make stories. I mean, there's like the WGA strike. There's 2 levels of a SAG after strike. The comic industry is in this really weird time of change and concern. I'm curious as to, like, as a storyteller, like, how does that feel from your side? Not just obviously the strike element, but just like the kind of changing landscape of it all. Like, does it feel like to some degree there's no right answers, or is now like a good time to find out what the right answers are for you? Do you find yourself trying to think about like, what is my path forward, because things are just so weird right now?
It's funny, like things are weird now, and they're weird in like every aspect of every industry, whether it's animation or television or feature film or comics or anything, and I think that we're just in this kind of weird moment in time that I don't know that we've ever seen before. Like there's an edge to everything, and I think that there's like a tension everywhere, and like what used to be just like negotiations and a back and forth is now like like a very hostile like thing. It just seems everything's a little heightened, everything's a little tense, everybody's like on edge right now, and like it just seems that everything is just a little harder than it needs to be for no particular reason. Like I think that I don't know what the answer is, right? But I mean, like, it certainly seems that wouldn't it be great if everybody could just take the volume down a little bit?
Yeah. I do think it's nice that you have a home in comics. It seems like that's something that you kind of always end up coming back to. Like, I think it's interesting. The last thing you had written, I believe, besides you wrote a story in Deadpool Black, White, and Blood?
Yeah, it sure was.
Yeah, and then before that, it was like the last thing you'd written was like a MODOK story, I think. So that was back in like 2015. But it does seem like comics are a thing that you kind of always want to come back to some degree. It was something that was big for you when you were young. It was something that was, big for you when you were established as a writer in animation movies, and it's big for you now. With everything that's going on, like what makes comics one you're always excited to come back to? Is there something like primal about your love for them you just can't turn off, basically?
Yeah, I think that's really it. Like honestly, like I have such an like innate and look, none of us would do it if we didn't love it. Like, like I think at the end of the day, like if you just want to make money, there's easier ways to make money. Like, like we're doing this because we love it. We love these characters, we love these stories, and we love telling stories, and like if we can't do it in one format, we're gonna find a way to do it in another format. But I think comic books especially, like, like it is a labor of love, like it has to be that way. Like it because you just wouldn't do it otherwise.
Well, and I imagine for you too, or I mean, really anybody who works in comics but also works in other mediums, there's something pure about it where if you come up with an idea, all you have to do is find, a few people to work with. And next thing you know, you can bring that story to life. As opposed to like with a film, it's like you look at something like Thor Ragnarok, you're talking about like thousands of people to make that happen. And there's like a pure simplicity in some ways to comics that allows it to be a storytelling medium that kind of anyone can do if you find the right people to work with. And there's something, I don't know, there's something kind of magical about that.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. And like even when I was a kid, like, like seeing comic books is such like a magical thing. Like it's absolutely true. Like, there is a magic to it. Like when I did Avengers, like there was like a thing I was most excited about was I got to do like a little comic book like side stories on it at the same time, and they were like in continuity with the show and like they mattered and all this stuff. But I mean, like the great part about it was I would occasionally go and talk to like elementary school classes, and I'd bring like a whole bunch of comic books and just like pass them around, and the kids went nuts. Like they would look at these comic books, and some of them never even seen a comic book before, like didn't even know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And they would like, look at these comic books with such wonder and such magic in their eyes. Like it was just like, it was probably the most gratifying thing I've ever done.
That's awesome. Well, I'm excited for more people to be able to see your work, even if they're not kids, with Unnatural Order. But Chris, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about Unnatural Order, your varying writing hats and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, dude. Like, this is great. And yeah, like anytime. I love this.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Christopher Yost. You can find him on Twitter at Yost and his work in this week's Unnatural Order #1 from Vault Comics. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Kenny Myers, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Mike Cancel, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polges, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hull, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Del Rey, Neer Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussett, Karen Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Norb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van Devent, Brian, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Pola, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stefan Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pachala, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Kill Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julia Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Scott McCovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed off-panels, outro, and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.